Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is incite. Before we take a look at the definitions, I want to acknowledge that the last week was a very challenging week in the United States. And with this week's verbs, I'm going to try and address some of the words you might be hearing if you are following the news. So some of the things might be difficult to kind of emotionally understand and deal with. I hope this won't be too painful for anyone, but that it becomes kind of a learning experience for us all. So now let's take a look at the basic definitions for this word. Incite can mean to encourage or stir up violent or unlawful behavior. Unlawful is another way to say illegal, against the law. A second way to use this verb is to urge or persuade. You're trying to convince someone to do or say what you want them to do or say. So it's to urge or persuade another person to act in a violent or unlawful way. And you probably realize now why I have picked this word. It's been used a great deal since Wednesday, and it will likely continue to be used a great deal in this very near future. We'll look at some example sentences as well as headlines, but I hope you can see that this word has a very negative meaning to it. So you're never going to hear someone say they incited joy or incited happiness. That won't work. Unfortunately, the objects or the things that follow this verb are usually quite negative. And again, we'll see some examples of that in a moment. You should know that incite is a regular verb. To make the progressive tense, we're going to drop the E and then add ing to form inciting. The past tense and participle forms of this verb are made by just adding a D. That's because this verb already ends in an E. When I say the base verb, incite, hopefully you can hear that ending sound is a T sound. So our past tense ending is going to make an id sound. Incited. There are no phrasal verbs that use incite, so we have no additional meanings to look at. That's going to allow us now to focus a little bit on some different verb tenses. Today, I'm going to make some sentences in the simple past tense and in the simple future. And I have collected examples of sentences that have been used in the news. I've also included some questions I've heard people ask with this verb. So remember, we're using the simple past tense to describe an action that occurred at a definite point in the past. So this is a completed action. To make an affirmative sentence in the simple past tense, we're going to use our past tense form of the verb. So this will be the form that ends with a D. Let's look at my example. On January 6th, the President of the United States incited an attack on the U.S. Capitol. So here, what is being described is that the President persuaded people to engage in violence at the U.S. Capitol building. If I want to make a negative sentence with it, in the simple past tense, you're going to see the form or the structure be did not and then the base verb. So we don't use the ed form in the negative. Here is an example sentence. She didn't incite the fight. Okay, so this might be a more general sentence, but again, I shared with you what comes after this verb is usually negative. So a fight, that's violent or negative. Finally, if I want to make a question in the simple past tense, I'm going to start with did then I'll have my subject, and then the base verb. Here's a question. Did other U.S. senators incite violence last week? I'll avoid giving my opinion to that question, but if you've had me in class, I think you know. Now, let's take a look at the simple future. To make a simple future, we have a few different ways we can do that. Today, we'll focus on making simple future sentences with will and our base verb. And the nice thing about this structure is that it's going to be the same no matter what our subject is. We'll always use will and then the base verb. And this format of the simple future sometimes is used for predictions. And that's kind of what I had in mind when I was making these example sentences. So let's look at an example of an affirmative sentence in the simple future. They will incite racial violence with their words. Again, that idea of urging someone to do something. If I want to make a negative simple future sentence, I need to insert not after my base verb, after the will, pardon. I think the subject has made me a little anxious to talk about it. So we're going to use will, not, and the base verb. Here's an example. The next president will not incite violent attacks. Okay. Finally, if I want to make a question in the simple future, I'm going to start with will, then I'll have my subject, then the base verb. Will the president incite more violence on January 20th? This is a question that many people have asked. January 20th is the inauguration, the start of a new presidency, a new term for President-elect Biden. He will become president at noon on that day. But there are many people who are worried that there could be more violence in Washington, D.C. on that date. I wanted to illustrate for you how often this word has been used recently. So I've got some photos here of U.S.-based newspapers who used our verb incite as part of their headlines. So here you see the New York Times with Trump incites mob. That's one example there. The Philadelphia Inquirer said incited by Trump, a mob. And I know this word's now been used a couple times. This is a very unruly and possibly violent group of people. So it tends to be a very large group. Generally, one or two people would not be considered a mob. The last example here from the Los Angeles Times, they used Trump incited mob storms the U.S. Capitol. So this form here is not a past tense use of the verb. It's sort of created an adjective to describe the mob, a Trump incited mob. I hope that helps illustrate, again, where you might have heard or seen this word in the last week. Now, let's take a look at some words that are related to our verb incite. The first is incitement. This is a noun. It's the action of provoking unlawful behavior or urging someone to behave unlawfully. So, again, this ties back to both of the definitions we looked at for the verb. Here is an example of incitement that, again, comes from a newspaper report. Twitter banned the president because of the risk of further incitement of violence. So further additional action of provoking violent behavior. Another word that you might hear is inciter. This is a noun. It means someone who intentionally starts trouble. Here is an example of this, again, from another recent news report. The president has been called the inciter-in-chief. So the person who intentionally started this illegal, unlawful behavior that created a great deal of trouble for many people and for the people who have died as a result of this violence. This insider-in-chief is a bit of a play. The US president is usually known as the commander-in-chief of our military. So this particular sentence is very much a critique or criticism, saying this is our leader of incitement, the leader who has provoked all of this unlawful behavior. And I don't know that I mentioned provoke. Think of urge again, trying to persuade or convince someone to do something. The last word we're going to look at today is sometimes confused with our verb. So what we're going to look at is right down here, make sure everyone is following, INSIGHT. The pronunciation is very close to our verb, but what's just a bit different is we're going to put stress on the first syllable in the word incite. Incite. Hopefully you can hear that the noun here is getting a little more stress at the first IN, those letters. That word is the power or act of seeing into a situation, a person, or thing. And I think it helps to also understand it's really sort of a deep understanding of something. So let's look at an example of this word in a sentence. The political science professor will give insight on the legal consequences of inciting violence. So again, this person has a deep understanding of this particular situation and is going to discuss this. Thanks so much for watching today's video. I hope you have a great day.